these sort of different influences that are keeping us from our faith and from what's truly important. What advice would you give to young people trying to live out their faith in a modern world that is quite anti-Catholic and anti-Christian?
Yeah, I think I think we've been blessed in the church in recent years with, like, John Paul II, St. John Paul II. I mean, he was such a wonderful model, and we need to be promoting people like John Paul II and Francis. I mean, at the moment he's got this great love for young people, as did Benedict. Like, Benedict continued the practice of World Youth Days and those sorts of things, and we need to, young people need to have a haven through which they can grow in their faith, and it comes about through good leadership. Like we've always, in this diocese, I think we've been blessed with a good youth ministry team.
Yes.
And I've always tried to support them as much as possible so that they can, and I mean, they've got the wavelength of young people.
Yes, yeah.
As we get older, we lose it a little bit, I think.
Well, I've always thought, I've been to Set Free and you're spoken, and you do have a way of engaging with you. Yeah. So how do you approach sort of speaking to young people and speaking to a generation that I guess is different to your own?
I think you've got to try and put yourself in their shoes, as it were, and it's where it's more and more challenging as time goes on, because, like, when I was a young person, we never had the challenges that the youth of today had, like drugs, for instance. We didn't know anything about them.
Yeah.
And there was sort of always a practice of you were supported and helped by your family too. I mean, if young people went off to dances, the parents would be aware of where they were.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nowadays, unfortunately, parents have sort of lost contact with their own young people sometimes, I think. And we see some of the tragedies that are happening around at the moment. Recently I was with Father Peter Tippany, who was the last priest I ordained before I came to Hamilton from Auckland, a lovely Maori priest from the Hokianga. And it was his nephew, who was a young promising rugby league star, who was killed in a brawl. And all he did was, because he was into sport and all that, he didn't drink alcohol or anything. He went to pick up a friend and tried to sort of be a peacemaker. And the brawl was taking place and he got smashed by a broken bottle. Terrible. Yeah. So that, I mean, and his parents didn't know that he was doing that. There are all sorts of challenges facing young people at the moment. So the role that we've got as pastors, I think, is to try and support young people as much as possible. With our schools, for instance, I've been thinking recently, if we didn't have our Catholic schools, we'd be quite ineffective as a community, I think. Our schools, like, you wish everybody in our secondary and primary schools was at church every Sunday, but that's one of the challenges facing us, I think.
So, as a bishop, you're a leader, and as a leader, everything doesn't go 100% as you planned all the time. How did you deal with problems, and especially I imagine there were at times quite major problems. What sort of advice would you give to people trying to deal with problems within leadership roles and within their own lives?
Well, the most important thing is faith in God, I think, and it's God's church and it's God's community. And sometimes I got a bit brassed off recently because there were 2 or 3 priests that I felt should go to another parish, but in the consultation process you do these days, some of them decided they didn't want to. So you can get annoyed about that and sort of resist it as a leader, or else you leave it in God's hands. I mean, that's what's happening, that those priests are entitled to feel the way they do, and you've got to give them that freedom, otherwise all you do in leadership is that you build up resistance. And you've got to have a lot of faith in it. No, it's God's church after all, so
Yes.
let God run it.
And what do you see as the future of this diocese, and what do you hope that this diocese can achieve heading into Father or Bishop-elect Stephen, I guess we call him now, time as the shepherd of our diocese?
I initially thought that it was about time Hamilton Diocese had one of its own priests as bishop, because Bishop Eddie, the first bishop, came from Auckland, I came from Auckland, and now Bishop Stephen's coming from Christchurch. And initially I felt as though it's time, this diocese is now 34 years old, it should have its own bishop. Anyhow, the Holy Spirit decided that it wasn't the case. The exciting thing for me is that Bishop Stephen knows so many of the priests in this diocese. He's either been in the seminary with a lot of them, or he's been the formator in the National Seminary for the last 6 years. So the more recently ordained ones know him. And to me that's exciting. I just observed last week when he was up here for a brief visit after his appointment, that the consultants, the College of Consultants we have, all of them except one knew him well. And they're excited about the possibility of almost one of their own becoming the bishop.
Yes.
So I think that's really exciting. That if we can really strengthen that spirit in the Presbyterian. They've got to remember that he's no longer, well, he is their peer in a way, but he's their bishop.
Yes.
And that will be important. And I'm sure he'll do it. He's such a gifted person. I think they're really exciting times ahead for Hamilton Diocese. We've got all sorts of challenges, of course. As talking about the introduction of the different ethnic groups into the church, I think one of the great challenges is that we've got to, while we welcome these people, we also have to give them an understanding that they're not visitors.
Yes.
And and they're starting to become involved, Filipino community and the Indian community especially. They're the big numbers that have been coming in lately. They add a new exciting mix to the life of the church. We've got challenges in that we could well do with more priests. So there's an amalgamation of parishes going on, and that will be one of the challenges for the new bishop. And well, it's underway, and he appears to be wanting it to continue in that way. So, but that's going to mean challenges to the people as well. You thought you owned your parish priest, and now you're sharing them with other parishes, that sort of thing. Yeah, there are lots of challenges. But I think, the faith of the community is a strong faith. So.
You spoke briefly about the relationship between a bishop and his priests and how sort of integral that is. How, even just, altar serving and working in the sacristy and having the different priests come in, you can tell how different their sensibilities were. Just last weekend I was in the sacristy and, Father Michael Geelan and Father Eamon and some of the deacons were standing around. They were discussing these new sort of interpretations of the liturgy and having a bit of a debate as to how it should, whether it was right or what was right, So how do you deal with, how do you develop relationships with, not just the priests, but then the priests as individuals with their own sort of sensibilities and their own sort of ideas about how things should work? And
I think by being with them, I think one of the important things for a bishop is that he's got to know his priests. He's got to know as many of his people as possible. And if there is any tension with the presbyterate, then his prime responsibility is to overcome that tension. Yeah. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard.
Yeah.